Hello, thank you for waiting. All right, and thank you for adapting to the 30-minute change in time. So today, this week, we're doing an assignment that's a little different, right? In which you're choosing to write on a topic pertaining to the culture war of the 1920s. And very generically, right, the culture war was it was fought on many fronts and fought between those who were embracing the changes that were occurring in the 1920s and those who were afraid and concerned about those changes, right? And so hopefully you've had time to read the introduction to this assignment. And note, I tried to note some of the major fields upon which the cultural war was fought. So firstly, right, we have here the new woman, right? And notice so much was focused upon with the woman because of the Victorian era that from which we had come. And a lot of the leaders of Prohibition and of the reform movements and those who seemed to have a counter lash at what was happening in the 20s were in the old middle class. And the middle class had especially been permeated by Victorian culture and influence in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. So by Victorian norms, I mean like kind of a strict adherence to Judeo-Christian principles, especially as it pertains to propriety and sexuality. And with that, right, there had always been a double standard for men and women. So they were especially strict on women. And so seeing the women as well as the men, of course, flaunt these Victorian norms, it was female deviance from those norms that caused the most alarm, right? So you see here that year in Muncie alone. So in Muncie, Indiana, they had an investigation. And, to what extent this was telling of the 20s, that's a whole other can of worms. It's hard because, you're getting the beginnings of Gallup polls. And so it's really difficult 100 years later to try to discern to what extent this was just a popularized image that was blown out of proportion to its numbers, and to what extent that this was indicative of what was really going on. But of course, to the conservatives, this was indicative of what was going on, right? This Muncie investigation. So you see here, 30 young women had been arrested for sex crimes, and half the young unmarried women interviewed admitted to having had premarital sex. The love letters were of a very forward nature. And then, of course, at that time, right, people couldn't help but see the correlation, if not causation, of Hollywood really coming of age at that time period. And on and off the screen, you see, I read an interesting book on an alleged evolution in Hollywood, on lapsing on Victorian norms, evolving from Mary Pickford, who was the damsel in distress, the orphan girl with her long locks and big eyes or doe eyes, and kind of adhering to a lot of that old separate sphere rhetoric of women being, inherently different, more fragile, more in need of help from the men, etc., to Clara Bow, and then ultimately to Louise Brooks, who became the femme fatales, right? Who would just kind of sleep around with men and break their hearts and have no desire to settle down, etc. Advertising in the 20s was indicative of a higher acceptance of sexuality and Freudian thought. As you could see clearly in the primary sources of the advertisements, a lot alluded to romantic love and sex, the idea of even the companionate marriage, not just outside of marriage, but within marriage. You see more of a broad acceptance of just enjoying one another romantically. Margaret Sanger with birth control, etc., as opposed to the old, more Victorian, or even prior to that, puritanical code of women. As soon as they come of age, their primary focus is to become the housewife and the mom of the children. And so you see an evolution, the deviance from that in the popular literature, in the press, in advertisements, etc. And so let's see here. And then they became identifiable, right, with Coco Chanel's attire, the flapper attire, right? So they became that became kind of a conspicuous outward symbol of this new woman going out, enjoying nightlife, smoking cigarettes, cavorting with men, dancing to jazz music, and illegally acquiring alcohol at a speakeasy, right? And so you have all of that here. Then the Harlem Renaissance was mentioned next in the introduction, and it largely, right, was kind of an attempt of the juxtaposition of African Americans, many of whom had experienced the flight of known as the Great Migration during World War I of African Americans from the South into northern cities like Detroit and Harlem, New York, and wanting to, to kind of display African creative culture capacity, if you will. You look at, the writings under Weimar Republic, like Mein Kampf, to go to an extreme, of Adolf Hitler and others, right? They're going to contend, and part of their argument for the inferiority of people of African descent is that they have no culture creating capacity. Well, they're gonna disprove that here in the Harlem Renaissance, right? And then you also have attempts, you see, so there's a degree to which it was kind of along the lines of self-help, right? Of African Americans lifting themselves up. But then you also see a degree to which African Americans were trying to achieve integration. They were trying to become fully socially, politically, and economically accepted by WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America, right? And trying to refute that Sambo image of the happy-go-lucky, animal-like African American who couldn't enjoy freedom even if you gave it to him or her. He or she would inevitably abuse it. So you have the Harlem Renaissance, which was huge in the 1920s. And then, of course, you have Prohibition. From 1913 to 1920, you had 3 amendments, right, added to the Constitution. And with a supermajority in both houses and a 2/3 of the state ratification, that's not an easy feat, right? And a lot of people say this was kind of the last gasp of the progressive era, of the progressives trying to bring in as much reform as possible, right? And so in the form of that, you have the income tax. And the idea of the income tax was supposed to be radical, and that it was from the very beginning meant to be graduated. So the more you make, the more you pay. So hence, in areas that were more socioeconomically downtrodden, like in many southern states, they were all for the income tax, because they kind of presently perceived that the wealthy in the northeastern states would pay the lion's share of this tax, which evidently was true during the 1920s. About, from a source I read, about 44% of the revenue from the income tax came from the wealthy in the northeastern states. So that was exactly what they intended. And the idea was for safety net legislation, right? For the money, because money doesn't come from, quote, nowhere, right? To use a double negative. And so they wanted to extract from the rich so they could help out with programs for the poor. And not to mention, right, this really gave added steam to the prohibition movement to prohibit the manufacture, sale, consumption, transportation of alcoholic beverages, because alcohol excise taxes had constituted one of the main sources of revenue. And they knew they could no longer make money if they prohibited alcohol, right? And so with the income tax, that was a huge substitute and took away that argument that it would cost money. And then also you have suffrage in the form of the 19th Amendment for women, female suffrage, the right to participate in politics, to vote and to run for office. And that's an interesting case in and of itself, for sure. And so at any rate, you have all this going on, and prohibition passes, right, in the form of the 18th Amendment, and the Congress tries to specify it with the Volstead Act. And anything 0.5% with the exception of industrial non-potable objects that were not meant to be imbibed. And of course, that was seen as a loophole in the 20s. So people like making hats, soaps, perfume, and these other things ended up getting involved in the illegal bootlegging industry in the 1920s in large numbers. And so, and then, you know, by virtue of the 20th Amendment around 1934 being passed, it nullified the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. So it's unique in that way, and that it was passed as an amendment and then it was rescinded 2 amendments later. All right. And then Warren G. Harding and his administration, you have, you know, the economic historians who try to contend, and they don't doubt for a second that they have an agenda, but just because they have agenda doesn't mean that there's no truth to what they said either. Is they're going to contend that Republican laissez-faire policies helped lead to the Great Depression. And of course, that's arguable, but we'll get into that further when we do the New Deal in the Great Depression right after test 2. But there was kind of a laissez-faire pro-big business atmosphere of the Republican parties of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover during the 1920s. Very little taxation, very little enforcement of the antitrust law, the Clayton antitrust or Sherman antitrust laws. But also, right, Warren G. Harding, when you look at biographies of him, it's unique in that you don't get a lot of original court histories of him because he's going to die by the end of his first term. And he's going to go down with a negative image of scandal. A lot of scandals occurred during his administration, most infamously the Teapot Dome scandal with oil. And so hence, a lot of the original histories of him are rather revisionist, or rather, you know, they're rather negative of him and his administration as a microcosm or mini example of what was wrong with the 20s, of everyone just kind of being laissez-faire and hedonistic during the 20s. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to get into the questions that you have to choose from. Okay, so give me just a moment here. Let's look at some of this stuff, if you don't mind. So should you choose number 1, to whatever extent it was accurate, what factors do you believe may have contributed to women's empowerment, liberation, or defiance of Victorian norms during the Roaring 20s? So for one, I have that women were empowered in the courts during the mid to late 1800s. They were granted rights as wives, rights of child custody, and the autonomy to divorce their husbands. A lot of this happened non-coincidentally because of westward migration. A lot of husbands were literally abandoning their families and not coming back, heading into the West. So the women began under the same kind of paradigm of women belonging in the private sphere, women being more fragile and more dependent upon a man. They were gaining rights being abandoned by their husbands. And so sometimes, right, for backward reasons, women were still gaining rights and opportunities. They finally gained the right to individual property in the 1870s in the courts. And so with that, right, you have the erosion of the laws of coverture. Under the English laws of coverture, a woman's identity, her property, a lot of her rights, her political voice were usurped by her husband the moment she got married. This began to unravel in the 1870s so that women could finally be seen as independent human beings and citizens entitled to their own rights and opportunities during the 1900s. So they were gaining rights there. And then the argument is that in fighting for other causes and demographics other than their own, other than the women themselves, they gained political experience and political organization that helped them to come in proverbially through the back door instead of just overtly taking men on and challenging the separate spheres paradigm of women belonging in the home. They use that separate spheres paradigm to their benefit. When you look at a lot of the leaders in the mid to late 1800s, a lot of them were well-to-do women who anomalously had an education and weren't able to do a lot with that education and with that wealth because of the expectations of society. Because women all the way up, at least to the civil rights movement, I would say, were expected to engage in pink collar employment, if at all. And by pink collar, right, I mean something that is culturally, historically reserved to women, like elementary school teachers, nurses, secretaries, phone operators, and other clerical jobs, etc., maids, what have you. So these women were anomalous. They stood out in that they had some money, they had some education, and they utilized that as a platform to try to empower women. So you have Mary Wollstonecraft of England, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women at the time of our founding fathers. You had women like Sarah Stearns and Julia B. Nelson in the Ohio Lakes, Great Lakes region. I want to say they were both from Minnesota, who began to politically organize women and try to, the equivalent to what later they would call the Equal Rights Amendment that the women tried to pass, right? To secure total political equality between men and women. You had path breakers, pathfinders, like in the form of Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Blackwell, in getting their educational degrees as women. And very interesting cases. You look at the vicious backlash that both these women incurred. I want to say it was Lucy Stone, but it might have been Elizabeth Blackwell. I get the two mixed up from my memory, and I apologize. But one of them earned the valedictorian mantle at a co-educational institution and was not able to give the speech because she was a woman. She was able to write it and allow a man to read it for her. I kid you not. So then you had women like Victoria Woodhull and Mother Jones, who were on the far left. And, some made the argument that they were discrediting women because they were seen as so radical with Marxist organizations. Victoria Woodhull, half jokingly to the nation, ran for president in the late 1800s. Needless to say, she didn't win. But still, right, these are path breakers, some of these women. And then you go back to your 101 class and recall the Seneca Falls Convention, right, in their Declaration of Sentiments, and asking for total political equality between men and women. Susan B. Anthony, right, illegally, because it said person in the New York Constitution. She went and voted, and she was arrested for voting. And her fans tried to bail her out, and she insisted that they not do so because she wanted to make a statement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a little less audacious, I would say subjectively, than Susan B. Anthony, but nevertheless a big proponent of women's rights and organizer. And Lucretia Mott, who grew up as a Quaker. And so hence she was, anomalous in that she grew up in a very egalitarian society in which she was treated no differently from men in her Quaker community, according to her. And so her expectations and her self-confidence were increased, right, by that. And so in going for these movements, right, against alcohol, against child labor, against slavery, etc., they began to equip themselves with the political tools that would help them in their 19th Amendment fight. Gathering petitions, right, getting a certain number of thousands of signatures, petitioning legislators at the local, state, and even federal level, having rallies, engaging in boycotts, giving speeches, which was seen to be, very audacious for the time for women to publicly speak and admit to a mixed crowd of men as well as women. And then by the time between 1910 and 1920, you had the NWA, the National Women's Association, under Alice Paul. and they were very confrontational. They went to the White House lawn. They were arrested. They had a hunger strike inside the prison. It's very impressive, their audacity, and really, to a large extent, their martyrdom. Although they weren't literally martyred, they were hit with rotten eggs and things, and pelted. They were arrested on several occasions. The press tore into them. You look at late, Gilded Age depictions of the feminist leaders, and they depict them as very manly and homely and just not ladylike, right? And so they incurred a lot of public obloquy, of a lot of criticism from the public in doing what they did. And then women entering the public sphere and working in the war industry factories during World War I, just like happened with World War II in the civil rights movement, right, for women. That was an empowering moment for them. And just the changes of the economy. The Second Industrial Revolution opened up a lot of white collar jobs that were grudgingly, even if half grudgingly, accepted as now pink collar jobs. So clerical and phone operational and other types of jobs opening up for women. So a lot of young unmarried women now faced the temptation not to get married, right? Because the expectation is once you get married, especially middle class and above, the man is supposed to be the breadwinner, and you're supposed to quit your job, and the man and just become a stay-at-home mother, and the man is to provide for you. But now, right, women were right at the cusp, evidently, according to our textbook, of becoming economically self-sufficient. According to Alan Brinkley in the textbook, women at this time began making about $22 per week on average, when the cost of living was between 20 and 25 per week. So they're almost becoming self-sufficient economically. And you look at the number of women who remained unmarried, it increased from a quarter of the population to a third, right? And then also you have higher education. The first famous college was Oberlin College in Ohio, began opening up in the mid-1800s to women. And then like Bryn Mawr, and I apologize, I don't recall how to spell. I'm a terrible speller, but it's something close to that right there. But Bryn Mawr University and other female universities opened up. And so in the 1920s, the number of college students tripled, right? And a large contingent, more than 50% of those tripling numbers were young women going to college for the first time. And so then there's the notion, right, of adolescence, which is a pretty modern notion, that you don't have to necessarily, as soon as you hit puberty, enter adulthood with all of the responsibilities that entails, but that now you could kind of sow your wild oats and find out what you want to do with your life and so forth in this intermediate adolescent stage of development, known as adolescence, right, in college. So some people were looking at that as well. Urbanization. For the first time in the census of 1920, more Americans lived in a city, defined as, I have no idea, it seems so arbitrary, but the number they usually use is 2,500 for a city. So the number of Americans living in a city had surpassed 50% in 1920. So a lot of young women were moving in or near the cities or in suburban areas, suburbia just outside the cities, and they could travel to the cities for their job, for their college education, and for entertainment, right, during the 1920s. As you find in the handout, I have the exact number, and I apologize. I'm going to throw out a number that may not be correct, but for a while there in the 1920s, this per capita disposable income went up as high as 37%. And so during the roaring 20s, more Americans had disposable income to spend, right? And then also you have a lot of things are bought on credit. 3/4 of automobiles, furniture, household things like a washing machine and a refrigerator are now bought on credit. Not to mention buying shares in stocks on the stock market became in vogue and accessible to the average person during the 1920s. And so, all this happened, the electrification process, so that cities developed nightlife almost overnight by the 1920s. And so now you have this fewer women immediately getting married, more of them going to college, more of them getting a pink or / white collar job and gaining some semblance of economic independence, at least before they married. And now all these advertisement and all these consumer-oriented temptations are available to them, right? And not to mention the automobile is giving them autonomy, geographic autonomy, right? To drive around, to travel, to visit the city and then leave it, etc. So all this is kind of coalesces in the popular narrative of this youth generation of the 1920s going wild, if you will, right? And so let's see here. Also, World War I, there was disillusionment with the war, and you have postmodernism. And postmodernism, as an artistic and philosophical movement, it posited that there are no moral absolutes, moral relativism, that there is no such thing as right and wrong, that everything is relative. Freud, I think personally, was kind of misinterpreted. To me, from what I recall, although it's been many years since the 90s as a student, but he, from what I understood, he advocated a semblance of balance, right? Whereby he told people in the Victorian era, if you repress your id, and your id are your natural instincts, right? If you excessively repress your id, it's going to result in manifestations of neuroses. You're gonna block all those. You're gonna repress, right, all of those instincts, and that they're gonna find their way out of you in an ugly, unhealthy, societally awkward, or even harmful manner. So hence, sometimes you ought to give into your id and tell your internalized mom and dad in the form of the superego to shut up and to do your thing. But in the 20s, they took it to the extreme in a lot of written primary sources, and contending that you should never suppress your id, and that it'll develop, in negative ways and unhealthy ways, etc. Which to me is taking Freud too far. But Freud was taken in that way, according to a lot of primary sources, in the 1920s. So, did all of this coalesce into empowering the women and to encouraging this flapper image woman of the 1920s? That's up to you to look into. Okay. Any questions on that one? Then number 2, should you choose that one? To what extent did the Harlem Renaissance earn popular or institutional respect, tolerance, or inclusion for African Americans? Well, clearly you could look at evidence for a crossover in WASP popularity and popular embrace of the Harlem Renaissance. You look at entertainers, Bessie Smith, Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen. Their works sold. There's just a lot of evidence for that. So that this was not just, their works were not just enjoyed by an African-American clientele, but by a WASP white American clientele. At the same time, you look at, the jazz clubs and some of the forms of social entertainment, and you find that the walls of segregation dismantling. You find common pictures in the speakeasies and some of these jazz clubs, and you find black and white participants dancing together. It's to such an extent, right, that Adolf Hitler is going to ban the jazz music and jazz culture and jazz clubs from Third Reich Germany, because he thought that it was emblematic of miscegenation, of interethnic sex. And so you have things such as that. However, you have evidence for persistent racial discrimination as well. For one, right, you look at evidence for a white counter movement against Harlem itself, burgeoning into a self-sufficient, diversified, industrialized city. They tried to bring in A. Philip Randolph later on, and oh gosh, I could picture his face, but his name is not coming to my mind right now. And another gentleman who really went out of their way to try to make Harlem an upscale city. And you find some evidence of that in your textbook. But there was a big white counterlash to it, so that it didn't end up happening. And so Harlem itself remained largely segregated. And you have that notion, right, of Americans in the form of like Josephine Baker. When you just Google her or look up a documentary on Josephine Baker, if one of the most salient things that comes up with her name is that she was a sex symbol. She had her most famous dances and shows. She was very scarcely clad. She was very scarcely clothed. She engaged in very sexually suggestive dances, but she sold out everywhere she performed. She became a star. But the idea is kind of like what people say today about perhaps Las Vegas, is white Americans were contending that they were slumming when they traveled to Harlem, that they would, engage in their id, if you will, and enjoy the fantasies and so forth, but then leave it behind, because that evidently wasn't a part of them. That was anomalous. It was out of the ordinary, right? But that was typical for African American people to be sexual like that and so forth. So major form of unfair and hypocritical projection by white Americans, and wanting people like Josephine Baker to be a sex symbol, but then blaming it all on her, right, for any of their indiscretions or impure desires, imputed it on the same old Sambo image of the animal-like African, right? And so you look at Josephine Baker herself. Yes, she had business go very well, and she had a love life that was tied to France. But you have quotes from her saying that France was far ahead of the United States in racial relations, and that she wanted to stay in France for that reason, that America was too backward, too racist, etc. And she had a couple incidents at clubs and at hotels and restaurants where she was discriminated against, despite her popularity, because of the color of her skin. You also see in the form of writers, right? I find this fascinating, like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen, in their private lives as well as in their works. You have books like Not Without Laughter and Home to Harlem. Those are a couple names of books whereby you get a Black protagonist, right, who is a living embodiment of a refutation of the Sambo image. He's intelligent, he's self-controlled, he thinks in long-term ambition. He's everything that WASP America, middle-class America, praises, right? And then there's another character in the book that is more of an apparent Sambo image. Another African character like Jim Boy and others in these books who want to chase white women, who want to drink all the time, who want to go to the jazz club and have fun. They want to live for the moment, live for the day, and they don't have much ambition. They speak poor, proper English, etc. Right? But by the end of the book, that Sambo character becomes like the medieval court jester, right? Who on the surface seemed like the clown, but has a lot of wisdom and maturity that were not evident at the beginning of the book. And then the leading protagonist experiences disillusionment. He experiences oftentimes the sad conclusion that no matter how much he hits WASP standards, intellectually, artistically, occupationally, he will never be accepted because the white public cannot get over the color of his skin. Okay, so like I said, I just find Langston Hughes, his life, the works that he wrote, so fascinating. So to me, I define that generically as an identity crisis. There was a part of them that was just yearning to separate themselves, right, from other African Americans and being accepted as white, basically. But on the other hand, shame of themselves for that urge, and a desire to say, you know what, Black is beautiful. There's nothing wrong with being Black, and I'm proud of it by the end of their books, etc. Right? And so Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, they lived with a white elderly benefactor, a white elderly woman who paid for them to live from day to day so they could just write and not have a day job. But as time went on in their biographies, she began to become more exacting, more demanding, and wanting to look over what they were writing and proofread it. So it was like he was in control, had control over him of this white establishment of wealthy white America. And so it's just fascinating to me. So Claude McKay, he has a very eye-opening poem called "If We Must Die," and he likens African American men to a rooster in the hen house, and the white man's coming to slaughter him. And he's saying, basically, if we're going to go down, let's go down swinging. And so Claude McKay, Paul Robeson, the singer, and other African Americans, they embraced communism. They joined the American Secret Communist Party. Paul Robeson traveled to Moscow and gave a speech to the Politburo and was not invited back to the US for doing such. And so some of them, right, were positing a new Negro, a new African-American man that said, you know what, I don't care about being integrated by white America or accepted by white America. I'm going to embrace my African roots, and I'm going to be proud of such, right? And I find an interesting, somewhat balance to that in the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois at that time, because W.E.B. Du Bois, right, on the one hand, he was very, very conservative, and that he wanted the most talented 1/10 of African Americans to prove themselves as living embodiment against the Sambo image, that African Americans could be as sophisticated, civilized, intellectual, intelligent, capable, ambitious as white folk. But conservatively, he wanted them to become integrated, accepted into white society, right? But at the same time, very proud of being Black and not forsaking that heritage. And so Marcus Garvey at this time had a Back to Africa movement, advocating that Black is beautiful. And again, not even trying to become integrated into white America, but to literally try to repatriate back to Africa, kick the European colonizers off the continent, and give it back to the African people. So to me, very, very fascinating times. The Harlem Renaissance, very fascinating. So to what extent do you think it succeeded and or it failed in its alleged goals? And then number 3, should you choose that one? Yes, please.
I have a question. So who was Monty Collins?
I'm sorry. Did you say who was Count Colin?
Yeah.
Count Colin was a poet. He was an African American poet, and he was very interesting in that he was kind of like Zora Neale Hurston. He was into popularizing African cultural creativity. So he studied everything from like African animism, the voodoo religion, lots of he praised Timbuktu, right, as a Muslim African college university town, and their achievements of the Mali Empire, etc. So he was very much into things African, right, and showing the culture creative capacity of Africans, but at the same time he loved white in his personal life, right? He loved white classical music. He became Roman Catholic, and so to a lot of people he was a living enigma. He was a puzzle, and that he was so for African American cultural creativity and things African in reviving them. But in his private life, he embraced a lot of European, kind of white practices and beliefs and institutions, etc. So that's what I recall of him, Jaden. I've read of him in chapters on books on the Harlem Renaissance, but I unfortunately have yet to read a biography just on him. But I can't help but think that it would be fascinating.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and so should you choose number 3, why do you think prohibition failed? Well, to the one extent, amendment's hard to pass. A 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, and then a 3/4 of the state, at that time 36 states ratifying it in their state legislature or by referendum. That's tough to do. So my point being is that if a cause is unpopular, it's arguably difficult to pass an amendment for that unpopular cause. And so the populists, the unreconstructed Southerners who were against Reconstruction, they did not want Black men to have alcohol. And yes, a lot of xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-African-American sentiment was tied to the prohibition cause. They did not like the idea of the immigrants, of African-Americans, sullying American practices and institutions like the family, etc., through the use of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol. The progressives were by and large against alcohol, right? The Methodists and Baptists and many other Protestant denominations of Christianity. The Anti-Saloon League, very powerful, very popular. The Women's Christian Temperance Union before them. Wayne Wheeler was a very effective leader of the Anti-Saloon League and being able to really go after wets, politicians who were for the consumption of alcohol. He ruined many careers. So they used heavy-handed ways, the Anti-Saloon League and other organizations, to get this amendment passed. Billy Sunday was a traveling evangelist and spoke very vehemently against alcohol consumption. And you have House reps and senators like Richmond Hobson of Alabama that single-handedly did a lot to get this passed. But despite that, right, is there evidence that it was never popularly embraced? Well, for one, right, look at defiance of the 18th Amendment. Look at cities like Chicago, where the mayor at one point of Chicago said he was not going to enforce the 18th Amendment, that he personally was against it, and he was not going to have it enforced in Chicago. Look at the fact that the U.S. brought in the Marines to Philadelphia because of Philadelphia's reputation for defying prohibition. So a lot of these cities in the East, especially, you have ample evidence of defiance, right? The fact that 1/10 of the members of the National Guard were removed from their positions for accepting money to turn a blind eye to alcohol going past their eyes, right? Just incredible. Evidence of dirty cops, again, especially Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. There's just so much evidence for it. The fact that only $2 million was laid aside for enforcing it. And at any given point, they had from 1,500 to the very most 3,000 federal agents. 3,000? That's it across the whole country, right? So they perhaps didn't muster the ample muscle to support and enforce this, right? And notice everything else was to be concurrent. It was to be with the help of the states. And many states, like I said, develop reputations for defiance, not just cities, but entire states, Indiana, etc. And so let's see here. And then also the lobbyist powers of the brewers, right? The United States Brewing Association, they were powerful. They gave millions, right, into political causes and into candidates, etc. And then not to mention, right, a tradition of American libertarianism, that even if we're inconsistent about it, that libertarian rhetoric has lived on from the time of the Revolutionary War. Big government, don't tread on me. And under libertarian American political tradition, especially if there is legislation in the social realm, it's one thing for the political realm, even the economic, but the social realm, like what I drink and my time off when I'm done with work, how I live my life on a Saturday or Sunday, that's much more controversial, especially under American political tradition. And so you have all those things to consider and to think about. And then, of course, the culture of the 1920s. Again, when the Marines came into Philadelphia, a guy named Smedley Butler was trying to clean house there. And he was just overwhelmed by the number of dirty cops that were involved complicitly in the bootlegging industry. And you have a quote in the book I'm reading called Last Call by Daniel Okrent. You have a quote here from the mayor of Philadelphia, and it said, basically, Marines, you're going to lose because of public thirst. That as long as there is demand, bootlegging is going to prevail. And at any given time, according to this book, bootlegging was making $2 billion a year. $2 billion back then. And so, of course, you have people like Al Capone, who became rock stars. And despite the fact that they had engaged in public murders, look up a guy named, you can't make this stuff up. Peg Leg Lonergan was murdered by Al Capone. The Valentine's Day Massacre, right, in 29. Bugs Moran's men were murdered by Capone. Frankie Yell going into a nightclub and killing Johnny Colosimo in front of a crowd of people, and everyone was too afraid to do anything about it and take the stand against him. And Time Magazine putting Al Capone on the front. A guy asking Al Capone, how are you making all this money? And Al Capone winks at him and says, my furniture business is doing well, which of course is a joke to everybody in the country, right? And so it was so just overt. Everyone knew that the bootlegging industry was alive and well and thriving, and killing one another in these public gang slayings. And they were almost, lauded for it. They were almost praised for it. And people wanted their autographs when they went somewhere publicly. And so, that type of culture of deviance is what you're allegedly contending with in the 1920s. And then not to mention what I don't really get into yet, but you may want to at least briefly mention, because it doesn't end until 1934, is the Great Depression, right? Franklin Roosevelt, and oscillating between a dry and a wet in his political career, finally gave public sanction as the newly elected president to put an end to prohibition. And he said, for God's sake, the country needs a drink because of the Great Depression. And so you have that factor also involved. But then also the political, the social capital enjoyed by Hollywood alone in the 1920s. They just seem to have been absolutely praised, and some people think emulated. And not to mention the leading administration under Warren G. Harding. Look up a guy named Jess Smith under Warren G. Harding. He had a location there in Washington, D.C., where he would accept bribes from bootleggers. And he's working for the president. And he ended up dying under mysterious circumstances because he began to talk about some of the nefarious things his administration was up to. And he mysteriously died by a shot to the head, where they contended was suicide. And a lot of people believe it was not suicide. So a lot of scandals coming from the top down, from Warren G. Harding's administration, Hollywood, and their highly publicized lifestyles and kind of debaucherous living. And so all of this, right, comes into effect when you consider perhaps why prohibition failed. Okay. And number 4 is pretty generic. To what extent were the traditionalist concerns reasonable or justified? I would, rather than biting off more than you want to chew, because this only being a week-long assignment, I'm only asking a page from you. And so pick a field, I would highly suggest and recommend, because, you try to take them all on. That's a lot. That's a lot to chew off, right? The new woman, prohibition, immigrants, the Harlem Renaissance, the teaching of macrospecies evolution in the high schools. That's just a lot to chew off. So maybe pick a field and to say, to what extent do you think traditionalist concerns were reasonable or justified, or of course not such? And so for not such, right, a very popular one might be the xenophobic wing of the traditionalists, those who are against immigration, against the new immigrants, against the Harlem Renaissance, etc. You have a resurgence of the KKK, born back again, arguably in 1915, and really came of age in the North, in states like Indiana, during the 1920s. Look at the National Quota Acts, or National Origin Acts of 21 and 24, highly discriminated against new immigrants in our immigration policies. And so, you could take that route. Another thing I wanted to mention was the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial, a gentleman agreed to be paid by the NAACP, the national organization, not the NAACP, I'm sorry, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. They would take on minority groups and try to defend them in the courts, right, with teams of lawyers. So the ACLU asked for someone to volunteer to go into the Bible Belt and illegally teach the theory of Darwinian exospecies evolution, of evolution from a primate stage, right, to the human species, as a theory in biology class at the high schools. And so Jonathan Scopes took that deal on, knowing full well what would happen. He was fired, and they took it on in a very deliberately publicized trial. And ostensibly, it was supposed to be fought over academic freedom, over autonomy or jurisdiction over curriculum, whether that be with the parents and the PTA, whether it be the superintendent and school board, and to what extent is there autonomy amongst the teachers themselves. But instead of sticking with those political, facts, it became a circus, whereby it became kind of a holy war setting. So Clarence Darrow came in. He was a very sarcastic individual, and right away he challenged the defense in firing Scopes and asking them if they really believed that Jonah was swallowed by a great fish. And do they really, how old do they believe the earth really was? Because there were a lot of New Agers, young earthers amongst the Christians. And so, like I said, you had people come and arm wrestle and box. One represented Darwinian theory in school, and the other one represented Judeo-Christian instruction in the public schools. It became ridiculous in the circus-like atmosphere that ensued. And the press, largely from the big cities, it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory for the conservatives. They won in the case. Scopes, his firing was supported, so he could not retain his job. But the ACLU, Clarence Darrow, and the press depicted the fundamentalists, as they called themselves, who believed in the 5 fundamentals of the Bible. And the most famous was the inerrancy of the Bible, that the Bible doesn't have any errors in it and is to be taken literally. That they were depicted as backward country bumpkins by the urban press. And so I find that topic very, very fascinating, because I know in the 1990s, you had something, apologetics had really taken hold by the 1990s. And that is, epistemologically, epistemology is the nature and origin of knowledge, that you follow the epistemological route of the empirical method, scientific method, and using that epistemology to try to support the Bible and to support the evidence of God. And so another term you might be familiar with is intelligent design theory. And so, like in Kansas in the 1990s, they made a compromise whereby half of instruction in the high school biology classes was to cover the theory of macrospecies evolution, and half the instruction was to carry intelligent design and apologetic teachings. And so, it's still not settled as far as jurisdiction over curriculum, who ought to make the final say in high school curriculum, public school curriculum. And so at any rate, just a fascinating topic. And then also to the conservatives, right? What they were afraid of was the obvious, is that the teaching of macro species evolution goes against the book of Genesis. And so if you try to refute and undermine the book of Genesis, then it'll cause a slippery slope of everything following the book of Genesis in the Bible, and that people would cease to feel accountable to a Judeo-Christian God with their morality. And so they would teach the kids that they're no different from animals, and hence there is no moral compass of right and wrong, and all hell would break loose in the public schools. And so that was a big fight in the culture war. As far as the ugly side of evolution, the ugly side of xenophobia, you could look up the Sacco and Vanzetti case, SACCO, and then Vanzetti, VANZETTI. These two gentlemen had circumstantial evidence against them. They were in Braintree, Massachusetts. Someone had been robbed in the early hours of the morning and shot and killed. They were caught on a trolley car, and it was very cold, and they were sweating, and they had the same Derringer pistol that was used to kill the person that had been killed and robbed. But beyond that, they had nothing as far as fingerprints, nothing as far as the money itself. So evidently that constitutes circumstantial, not direct evidence. And when they went to their trial, the fact that they were Italian immigrant anarchists became widely spoken by the judge, who made it clear that he didn't trust them, that they represented everything that was dangerous to the country, etc. So a lot of Hollywood stars and politicians chimed in and tried to plead for their exoneration, to be exonerated, to no avail. They were given the electric chair. And so to some people, it was testimony to the anti-immigrant sentiment of the 1920s, the deaths of Sacco and Vanzetti. And then number 5, to what extent did hedonism or irresponsible decision-making or behavior during the Roaring 20s contribute to the Great Depression? So buying things on credit irresponsibly, right? Just a craze of consumerism of the 1920s, buying stock on credit and the abuses and lack of regulation of the stock market, that plays into it as well, into the popular narrative. Corporate greed, concentration, lack of paying taxes by big business at this time. The fact that the trickle-down economics of the Republican administration did not seem to be working. The idea, right, that if you allow big business to keep their revenue and not take it by the form of taxes, that they will hire more workers, open more plants, etc., right, in ways that will trickle down to other people. It didn't seem to happen in the 20s, at least. A lot of them just simply bought more yachts, went on more trips, and splurged their money in ways that did not trickle down to new clients, new employees, better wages, etc. All right. So we're going to get into that further into the Great Depression and New Deal after test 2. All right. So are there any questions on this assignment? So what I want to do is I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to go to the test. Okay. And see if you have any questions on the questions. Now, bear in mind, the last 3 on test 2 and 3, you're on your own, okay? By test 2 and 3, I'd like you to answer your own questions from the textbook.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Jaden.
So, what is the difference between a fundamentalist and a traditionalist?
So a traditionalist was the much more generic title, right, of someone who wanted to maintain American traditions. So a traditionalist could have simply been against the new woman and jazz music, could have simply been against alcohol consumption, right? Could have simply been an xenophobe and been against immigration and Roman Catholics and Jews and African Americans, right? Or also could have been against the teaching of evolution in schools. So the traditionalist is a much more of a generic blanket term for those who were concerned about the changes of the 1920s and were technically not even conservative. You might make the argument conservative, wanted to conserve, right, the status quo, but were even regressive. They wanted to go back to the good old Victorian days, right? The fundamentalists were focused almost solely upon religion, upon Christianity, and things that pertain to what they saw as the moral downfall of the country. So the two happen to, overlap in many ways, but the fundamentalist was much more micro oriented. He was oriented just toward things religious.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anyone else? Any questions on any of these test questions before I ask that of you next week?
I had a question, Derek. So,
Yes.
so you said this is so the exam is next week?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. And so we're not gonna go over the study guide the same way we did last time, right?
Yeah, I'm not going to go question by question like I did on test one, to be honest, because this is college.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
but I will offer opportunities for you to ask me questions, and I'll
Okay,
speak about things kind of generally. So I'll
okay,
still do kind of an overview of the test, but just not question by question like I did for test one.
okay. No worries.
Thank you, Kevin. All right. So anyone else?
Yeah, I have one more question.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about the 18th and 20th Amendments?
Yes. So the 18th Amendment, right? It was really abetted by the suffragettes and the women's movement supporting it. It was helped by the political power and organization of the Anti-Saloon League and the leadership of the Anti-Saloon League. It was helped by the Bible Belt in the South, the populists and the unreconstructed Southerners, right, who didn't want Black people to have alcohol. It was helped by the Progressive Party, and it also was helped by big business, because big business, right, it was in their best interest to want to have sober workers, right? Because it literally had become a mundane reality in the Gilded Age for a lot of workers not to show up on Monday, literally hung over. And so, you know what I mean? It was a curious combination, an alliance of these disparate groups that certainly had their own reasons for supporting it, their own priorities, their own goals, right? But you got enough of them to pass an amendment. So like I said, you have the women's movement, you have the Bible Belt in the South and the populists. You have the progressive reformers, the middle-class urban reformers who were against alcoholism for many reasons. Because remember, the progressives, they thought that alcohol was dysfunctional, that it led to things like the poor family wasting its money on alcohol that could be saved to get them out of the proletariat, right? Domestic abuse, estrangement of the husband leaving the family, et cetera, et cetera. So they almost looked at it scientifically as destructive to the nuclear family and destructive to the American dream. So like I said, when you have that many demographics from those different segments of society, when they united, it helped the 18th Amendment to get passed. And like I said, you have congressmen like Richmond Hobson and others that were very just tireless crusaders for this amendment, where he had failed from 1913 up to 1920. He had failed at least 3 or 4 times in trying to get it passed in the House. And so, and then by virtue of the 20th Amendment, you get into question number 3, is to a lot of people, like, for instance, when you look at the popular writers, like Upton Sinclair, H.L. Mencken, who else? F. Scott Fitzgerald, and other of the major writers and intellectuals of the 20s, they wrote as a matter of fact that that prohibition was a joke as far as its enforcement, that it was not seriously taken by the country, that the degree to which it was defied, even by corrupt police officials and politicians, was a stain for the country, right? And then I also do think you have the fact of the Great Depression, of Americans feeling like that there was fear of a revolution, of a revolution from below during the Great Depression. You find that from FDR and his administration, and we'll get into that right after the test. And so I think there's argument also that FDR's administration and that generation said, you know what, we need to give some catharsis to the American people. Let them have some form of escape. It's a joke anyway, as far as how badly it's being defied and how poorly it's being carried out. And so I think all those, contributed to its demise in the form of the 20th Amendment in 1934. And the span of 14 years is a long time as well. So it had 14 years to develop a reputation as a failure. Sorry, did that help at all, Jaden?
Yes, that did.
Okay, good. I hope so. There's just always so much to learn. I've read a couple books on prohibition, and I want to read more. There's just, that goes for all these topics, though. I want to read more on the Harlem Renaissance for sure. All right.
Hey, Derek, I had a
yes.
this is kind of a bit going back, maybe a little way back. I probably should have had this information by now, but Alan Brinkley, is he considered a revisionist history writer?
You know what? I mean, in making the simple dichotomy between a court historian and a revisionist historian, I would say Alan Brinkley is revisionist, for sure. A lot of times,
Okay.
right, instead of adhering to ideological
Okay.
causation, that, people, that leaders were romantically motivated by this or that impulse to try to improve the country or do this and that. He more than hints oftentimes that there were economic factors, desire to maintain control and order on behalf of those who were governing. And so with his causation, I would say that Alan Brinkley is revisionist as an historian. And that's a great question. All right, so anyone else?
Thank you.
You're welcome, Kevin. All right, so that's it for me. If you don't have any other questions, Jaden.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So did Harlem become like a white collar city?
It did not. Yeah, it did
Okay.
not. Yeah, it stayed largely dilapidated. Demographically, a lot of the people there were still members of the proletariat. A lot of unemployment and marginalization continued well past the 1920s. I mean, you get that depiction of Harlem in the 1990s with the Puerto Rican community and others. And so, yeah, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Laura, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Just
Good.
listening to all your guys' questions.
Okay, good. Good. All right. Narayan,
Hi, I'm doing good. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Okay. You have a nice evening.
You too.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a day. So you guys have a great week. Be safe and try to enjoy this a little bit. Pick your question early enough that you don't feel rushed for time, and you could do a little bit of examination. of, YouTube documentaries or websites, and have a little fun with it. All right.
Alrighty, thank you, Derek.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate you guys. I'm going to give you 4 points instead of 5 again as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaden, as always.
All right, Derek, thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Bye, Kevin. Appreciate you.